This time next Christmas, London could look a lot different. Oxford Street should be pedestrianised and below ground, the capital should have a new rail line. To mark the year to the day Crossrail, or the Elizabeth line as it's called, goes live, today London got a new tube map. But there was some confusion about how much it'll cost to travel on it. Our political correspondent Simon Harris is at Paddington this evening, one of the key stops on the new line. Simon.
Nina, Crossrail has been talked about for generations. It almost got built in the 1990s but was cancelled by the government of the day. Now, after more than 8 years of tunnelling and construction, transport bosses are confident enough to predict that this time next year, the Elizabeth line, as it's now known, will finally be up and running. The first new underground in London for almost 2 decades. On London's newest railway, the clock is ticking. Beneath the streets, the Crossrail construction teams are on a deadline. The workers in orange have exactly 1 year left to finish the £15 billion project. The stations are taking shape, the new trains are being delivered. But when it comes to ticket prices, the message is not exactly clear. Is it safe to assume that somebody travelling by tube on the Central Line from Ealing Broadway to Liverpool Street will pay exactly the same as somebody travelling on Crossrail on the same section of the route?
Yes.
Can you guarantee someone travelling, say, from Ealing Broadway to Liverpool Street on the Central Line will pay exactly the same as the same journey on Crossrail?
We haven't actually agreed the fares system yet.
There's no intention to charge a different fare structure in central London for the Elizabeth line.
We'll be announcing the fares in the spring period.
The Elizabeth line appears on the latest tube map published today, but it's not the final version. To begin with, it's effectively 3 separate lines, with interchanges at Paddington for passengers from West London, Berkshire and Heathrow, and at Liverpool Street for those coming in from East London and Essex. Some commuters will enjoy direct trains into central London from day one. But others will have to wait a further 12 months until December 2019, because Transport for London has opted for a staggered launch. That should allow any snags to be ironed out before the full service begins 2 years from now.
Big bangs are always exciting, but they don't always go according to plan. A staged opening makes sure that each time they're opening a new phase, we make sure it works, and I think that's more in the interest of passengers than not.
London has waited a long time for the Elizabeth line, and expectations are high. Not only should it ease pressure on the creaking and overcrowded Central Line, not only will it connect the city and Canary Wharf to Heathrow Airport, but we're told this one railway will boost Britain's economy by £42 billion.
Simon, so why can't we get a clearer picture of the fares on the new line?
Nina, Transport for London is confident that in central London, Elizabeth line fares will match those on the Underground. Where it gets more complicated is in the outer suburbs and beyond. TfL has never operated trains in some of these areas. There's no existing zone structure in places like Reading and Maidenhead because the Underground never went that far. That's what they're trying to work out now. But I think we're going to have to wait and see if using the Elizabeth line from these outer reaches does cost any more than using existing trains.
Simon Harris, thank you.
Dozens of sexual assault cases in London are being urgently reviewed by the Met Police tonight after the collapse of 2 rape cases in a matter of days. Both were being investigated by the same officers, but both were thrown out of court after it emerged evidence which could have helped the defence was not disclosed by detectives. Scotland Yard denies there is a systemic problem in the force, but there are calls tonight for a full and thorough investigation. Our correspondent Simon Harris has the latest.
Liam Allen and Isaac Itery, 2 innocent men charged with rape. 2 men put through the ordeal of a criminal prosecution only for the cases against them to collapse. Now Scotland Yard has ordered a review of all of its current rape and sexual assault prosecutions. Isaac Itery was due to go on trial at Inner London Crown Court on charges of raping a girl under 16. Mr Itery spent 4 months in prison waiting for his trial to begin. But now the case against him has been dropped after prosecutors concluded there was no realistic chance of a conviction. The decision came after Mr Itery's lawyers submitted a new defence case statement on Friday. That prompted a detective to carry out a review of the evidence, including the girl's text messages. On Monday, the police passed what it called relevant material to the Crown Prosecution Service. The officer in charge of rape investigations says it proves the system works.
If disclosure is being conducted robustly and properly, we should expect from time to time that we will withdraw cases as a result.
Do you owe Mr Itery an apology?
We will review the case, and if there was anything that we could have done differently, then clearly we will be apologising to Mr Itery.
So, you know, you're leading sort of two separate lives but parallel.
On Monday, the other accused man, Liam Allen, told ITV News how he coped living under suspicion for 2 years before the case against him was dropped. It was the prosecution barrister, Jerry Hayes, a former MP, who first alerted the judge.
This is just the tip of the iceberg, and it should be every single police force in the land who should be reviewing what's been going on. We've got to retrain police officers.
The Prime Minister told MPs today the rules about disclosure would be looked at.
That my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, had, even before these cases came up, actually initiated a review into disclosure. I think it is important that we look at this again to make sure that we are truly providing justice.
Scotland Yard insists officers in rape cases are not routinely withholding evidence. But after the collapse of 2 trials, it is the Met now under suspicion.
The Met say at least 30 cases are under review, but it's thought that many more may need to be investigated.
Yes, those 30 are the cases that are going to be prioritised by the Met in this review because they're the ones that are due to come before court very shortly. But there may be many, many more because all cases of rape and sexual assault are going to be included in this review to see if there's any evidence which should be handed over to the defence. I've been asking Scotland Yard all day for a precise figure. They say they just don't know at this stage, which is quite surprising. Clearly, the Met needs to do something to restore confidence after the collapse of these 2 cases, but senior officers say they are very different. In the case of Liam Allen, they acknowledge that something went wrong. The evidence should have been handed over to the defence. It wasn't. They just don't know yet why it went wrong. But in the case of Mr Itery, they say it is a case of the system working. An officer looked at the evidence, realised there's something which might support the defence case and passed it on. But of course, by then, Mr Itery had spent 4 months in prison on remand.
All right, Simon Harris, thank you. It was emotive language that Sadiq Khan used to justify his decision to put up council tax in London at the end of a year that has seen 4 terror attacks in the capital and the terrible fire at Grenfell. He said people need to pay more in order to stay safe. He blamed the government for cutting the budgets of the police and the fire service and said the 5% rise in tax would help make up the shortfall, but it means an extra £14 on the average household's bill, as our political correspondent Simon Harris reports.
4 terror attacks in the space of 12 months and a devastating tower block fire. These were the events of 2017, which London's mayor used today to justify his council tax hike. Sadiq Khan accused the government of making dangerous cuts to police and fire services.
The reality is I'm left with no choice. The government is simply failing to invest what is needed to fulfil their most important responsibility, to protect the citizens of this country. So my intention is to increase the policing element of council tax by the maximum amount.
The mayor proposes to increase his share of council tax by 5.1%. That amounts to an extra £14.20 next year for the average Band D household. This is the biggest rise in council tax levied by a mayor in more than a decade. It's also Sadiq Khan's second successive increase. In an extraordinary outbreak of cross-party unity, City Hall Conservatives backed the idea of higher council tax bills to pay for policing. But they attacked the mayor's language and the suggestion Londoners aren't safe.
I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s in London, and in those days the IRA was bombing London seemingly quite frequently, and the police had far fewer officers than they do now. We didn't feel unsafe then, and I think it's very dangerous for the mayor to be going around using the kind of language that he is at the moment.
The government sets limits on council tax bills, but earlier this week the cap was raised to allow local politicians to spend more on policing.
Not only were councils and City Hall required to explain cuts in spending, they're now in the position of having to explain council tax increases in an attempt to pull back the situation. And the government will, to some extent, get off the hook, yeah.
So it's a way of passing the buck?
There's no question that the government has pass the buck to London taxpayers, council taxpayers, via the mayor and the boroughs.
The mayor's council tax increase is unlikely to be the only squeeze put on household budgets next year. Londoners could face further rises when the boroughs send out their council tax bills.
Simon, the Mayor began this year by promising to save Londoners money. He's actually ending it by costing them more.
Yes, you'll remember it was the Mayor's big election promise that he'd save Londoners money by freezing fares on public transport. Well, that fares freeze came into force at the beginning of the year, although, as we now know, it didn't apply to all fares and certainly not to travel cards. Now, at the end of the year comes what you might call the Mayor's Christmas council tax bombshell, putting up council tax by the biggest share since Ken Livingstone raised his share by more than £15 11 years ago. The Mayor is counting on Londoners buying his argument that he's been forced to do this to keep us all safe because of government cuts. The government's counter-argument is that funding for police and fire services hasn't been cut. There's extra money available for counter-terrorism, and London has more police officers per head of population than anywhere else in the country.
All right, Simon Harris, thank you.